It's time to gather loved ones together for all the holidays' best spread. Lynn's has great prices on all your favorite Thanksgiving items, from delicious turkey with all the fixings to mashed potatoes and yummy pies. We have everything you need to create your perfect Thanksgiving dinner. Whether it's cooking the traditional meal, completely store-bought, or a combination of both, your best holiday meal starts here. Learn more and start shopping today at linsgrocery.com. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
The views and opinions expressed by A Little Bit Culty are those of the hosts and don't reflect the official policy or position of the podcast, right, Sarah?
Correct.
Any of the, quote, fire content, I prefer lava content, provided by our guests, bloggers, sponsors, or authors are the opinion and are not intended to malign a religion, a group, a club, an organization, business individual, anyone or anything, unless, Sarah?
You're a douchebag.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. Also, we're not doctors, psychologists, or wizards. We're just two non-experts trying to make you a friendly, informative podcast based on our experience that we've turned into wisdom. Okay?
Good talk.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Sarah Edmondson here.
And I'm Anthony Ames, a.k.a. Nippy, Sarah's husband, and you're listening to
A Little Bit Culty,
a.k.a. ALBC, a podcast about what happens when devotion goes to the dark side.
We've been there and back again. A little about us. True story. We met and fell in love in a cult. And then we woke up and got the hell out of Dodge.
And the whole thing was captured in the HBO docuseries The Vow, now in its second season.
I also wrote about our experience in my memoir, Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life.
Look at us, a couple of married podcasters who just happen to have a weekly date night where we interview experts and advocates in things like cult awareness and mind control.
Wait. This does not count toward date night, babe. We got to schedule that. That's separate.
So those 2 days we got to hang out?
We do this podcast thing because we learned a lot on our exit ramp out of NXIVM. Still on that journey, and we want to pay the lessons forward with the help of other cult survivors and whistleblowers.
We know all too well that culty things happen. It happens to people every day across every walk of life. So join us each week to tackle these culty dynamics, everywhere from online dating to mega churches and multi-level marketing.
This stuff really is everywhere. The cultiverse just keeps on expanding, and so are we. Welcome to Season 5 of A Little Bit Culty, serving cult content and word salads weekly on your favorite podcast platforms. Learn more at alittlebitculty.com.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, hanging on to the wind of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
And we're action. Live, Sarah. 3, 2, 1. You're on, girl.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back.
Everybody.
How
many people's that, Sarah?
Over 100,000 per episode.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
All right. I think
listeners.
we're up to 125.
Thank you for sharing this podcast and for getting it out there. We are growing, and we appreciate you.
Let's do some basic math here. 17,000 people went through the... Okay, and now we're up to 120. Okay, just checking. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Changing the world. Anyway, as you were.
Okay, guys. So as promised, we are going to do today for you, very special, a Season 2, the VOW, aka The Vow, recap. This was difficult. We've been promising this for a while, but we had to recover. It was the holidays, but also we had to recover. It's been a while, just taking the time to percolate on all the things that have transpired, things that we learned in The Vow Season 2, and literally just to let it all settle.
Move into a new place.
We also moved into a new place.
It's great being in the same room with you. Now people aren't going to complain about me cutting you off anymore.
I don't know.
Don't cut me off.
I don't know if that's true, but we'll see.
Right.
We'll see what happens. So what happened here was that Nippy and I were planning this episode, and then we were kind of like, I don't want to say bored with each other, but we just didn't really want to do it just by ourselves.
Bored's a strong word. However, sometimes appropriate. I don't know if it's bored. It's just, I need my space.
Sometimes, and also sometimes it's nice to have a third perspective. So we thought it would be fun to have a very special guest interview us about what we thought about Season 2 of the VOW. And we chose somebody who's kind of a perfect expert, don't you think?
Yeah, and just a great personality and person to kick things around with, and ultimately ended up being a supporter of us.
Yeah, and somebody that we met through this whole debacle. Actually, I haven't met her in person. Nippy has met her in person. Yeah, so Ayla Fitzpatrick worked in Albany, New York at News 10 ABC covering NXIVM. She reported on the arrest and the trial of Keith Raniere and has continued to follow daily updates on the case. She now lives and works in South Carolina. Although she's no longer a working journalist, she keeps up to date with what's going on in the cultiverse.
You might recognize her. I think there's footage of her in the VOW doing a mad dash sprint to the courthouse.
Yes, you've definitely seen her in both seasons of The Vow with a microphone in hand and long brown hair and looking very professional. And she's become a virtual friend, as it happens in this day and age.
She's one state over.
Yeah, one state over. So let us introduce you to Ayla. That rhymes with Kayla. We were calling her Ayla for a long time until we...
Actually, I was, and then she corrected me.
Enjoy this episode, and there will be lots more debrief. If you haven't seen it already, there's our reactions after every episode, as you probably all know by now, on our Patreon. You can see those
Patreon.
on our Patreon. So you can see our post-episode debrief lives. We are going to start more lives. And on our Patreon this week, if you want to continue this conversation, we got lots of questions and commentary that we asked our audience there about what's your favorite moment? What did you want to see more of? What did you want to see less of? And so we'll be having part 2 of this discussion.
More interface, yeah.
Yeah. And to hear that, you only have to do the, what level is that? The $10 a month, which includes an extra episode every week and ad-free listening, which I think is a pretty amazing price.
Yeah.
That being said, here you go.
Ayla
Fitzpatrick. Hi, Ayla.
Hi.
Thank you for jumping on and being our very first special guest, getting to interview us. I can't believe we've never met in person, which sucks, but we're going to change that now that we're all in the South.
Isn't that crazy? We're all in the South?
Yeah.
Actually, Nippy and I have met.
Oh, that's
true.
right. At the courthouse.
In the overflow room.
I'll never forget. I was always trying to figure out who you were because I didn't know who you were. I was trying to figure out like which side you were on, what was okay to say to you, and like what wasn't okay to say to you.
To be frank, I was still kind of in the embarrassment shame mode and didn't really want to talk to anyone. But I also was there because I wanted to see that guy burn.
I think a lot of us were in that same boat.
And also, I didn't know who was who, like former friends, and they were in the overflow room, and I just didn't care about getting into it with anyone. And
I missed out.
Yeah, for sure.
I have FOMO from 3 years, whatever that was, 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
You had a newborn.
I was nursing a newborn.
What a weird like FOMO thing
Yeah.
to have about such a strange topic, but it is kind of, something that is a big part of y'all's story. So I get it totally.
It was a mixture of like, I'm so glad I'm not there. And also I really wanted to be there.
I'm glad we weren't a part of it. And I'm glad that our story was at the central focal point. And what we had done had handed it off to the powers that be to go and really find the crimes that put him away. I mean, ours were
Peripheral.
Not only that, but also like I wasn't confident our story was enough to put him away. And then once we started finding out what was really going on, ours seemed kind of superficial in terms of how abusive and how bad it was.
Yeah, we got off lightly in comparison.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, I know how you love segues, and that feels like a great segue kind of into the season 2 of The Vow, because it's kind of a similar thing. Your stories set up season 1, but then season 2 really got into all of that stuff that Nippy was just talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a relief. Like a lot of people asked us, how do you feel about it? And like, you're not in it as much. Is that okay? And I'm like, this is the amount that we were in it overall was just perfect for, the fact that we were in a new city and we were moving and like the onslaught of response, just even based on how little we were focused on, was almost too much to handle. So I can't even imagine if we were this, the center point as much as we were in season 1, that I may have not survived that emotionally. Don't you think, Nip? Like it was re-traumatizing enough.
Yeah. And also I think way more people saw season 1. So it was,
that's true.
Season 2 was fine for me. Putting this in the rearview mirror has been my MO from the get.
But also, don't you find like season 2, like every episode was it like with the Tourette's episode, the Lauren episode, the Daniela episode, we'll break those down later. But generally like our presence was sort of there throughout, but the focus was more on these other people. And we knew what had happened because we followed the trial, but like many people didn't know what happened to Daniela and didn't know what Keith promised Lauren. So to kind of relive those terrible things with the rest of the world, it's like I'm not watching things that happened to me. I'm watching things that happened to people I cared about. And even though I knew it, it was still like another wave of holy fuck.
It's definitely strange when you have that knowledge, and it's kind of one of those things where you feel like, well, this is such a big part of this situation that this must just be knowledge that everyone has. And then to go back and realize that some of those things, like the room and everything with Lauren, is brand new information for a lot of people who, like you said, weren't there for the trial and don't already know that those things happened.
Totally. You were there for most of the trial, right?
For a big chunk of the first part and most of the last part of the trial. So because I was working, for a news station, the ABC affiliate up in Albany at the time, obviously there was, news to go back and do in Albany during this trial as well. And that's kind of something where as a local news station, you struggle with a little bit, kind of figuring out when to cover and what to cover. So we were really looking at, who was going to be taking the stand and what we thought was going to be important to be there for, but also with a federal trial, it's so close to the chest. They don't give a lot of information ahead of time, ahead of the day of. So you kind of have to guess and hope that you're right and that you're there for the stuff that's important.
Had you heard of the NXIVM stuff before it blew up?
So the first time I heard of it was actually when I saw the New York Times article, Sarah, that, you obviously kind of gained some notoriety from and opened the floodgates. And I've written this down in a few different forms because it almost feels like a memory that would be a scene out of a movie for me. I was sitting in my bed 10 minutes away from Clifton Park reading this article about all of this stuff. And I was like, this can't be Albany, New York. Like, this has to be Albany, Georgia, or an Albany I've not heard of before. It's like, there's no way this is happening literally 10 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. And after that, for me, my journalism brain just kind of kicked on. And I was like, I am going to dig and I'm going to find people to talk to and I'm going to figure out everything I can figure out about this. Because even then I felt behind. There was so much that had already happened. And I already felt behind and I wanted to know everything. I just have a very curious mind like that. And it took some time to be able to do the story on a local news level because you have to wait for a lot of things to come out to be able to support your reporting. But once that happened, it was very behind me on, pushing those stories, doing daily updates and doing whatever we could do to kind of do our part in all of it, which seems so small compared to the part that, you all had to play in it. But I think it was still important for sure.
Well, ironically, the word we would have used back in the day would have been interdependence. It was an interdependent project of shining light. Wouldn't you say, Nippy?
Sure, Sarah.
Every now and then this like vocab word pops up into my mind and I'm like, it's a word, it's a word that people use in reality, but it was also a word that was like, abused to get people to do things like, oh, well, if you work interdependently, then you will be okay with scrubbing toilets for free, for example. But yeah, so since you covered it so extensively, what did you think of The Vow season 2? Because so much of it was legal reenactment or trial reenactment overall. Did you feel like it captured the essence?
It was so different than what I was expecting it to be, but not necessarily in a bad way or a good way, just a lot different. I thought the reenactments of the court transcripts were a good way to kind of get across, their exact words that happened in the trial and really kind of just kept it. It's hard to take what someone said in such an emotional time in their life and something that really impacted them so much and then paraphrase it and try to get across the same emotion and the same meaning. So I was glad that they didn't try to do that for the most part, that mostly they just did the court reenactment transcripts, which I thought was a good move on their part. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I totally agree. Also, without cameras in there, you have to have something that's the next best thing, I guess, to put it, because I think paraphrasing, it's you don't get tone. There's so much that's lost in translation. So I mean, unless there's something that could be better than that, audio or something like that, I don't think you could convey it any better than that.
And that was something that a lot of us journalists who were there did, in real time as well. We would get the full transcript after the day was over. We would get it emailed to us. And I would go back through in my hotel room and I would just read the whole transcript again, because even sitting there when you're used to being able to have a recording system and then you're not able to, I mean, your hand can only move so fast. You can only take so many notes. So that was something that, at least I did. I sat there and I would go through the transcripts and I would live tweet the transcripts as I was reading back through them again. So those were a big part of my reporting. So it was interesting that they pulled from that too.
What of all the days you covered left the strongest impression on you of what was going on and how you understood what was going on?
I mean, other than the verdict, obviously, right? Because that was, I think, probably the most impactful day for, I think, anyone who had any stake in the game. But I was there for, and this didn't get it got some coverage in the second season, but Sylvie's testimony, because I think it really showed kind of the longevity of the abuse and kind of the slow burn and the convincing. And, well, if you just put in the work to be an elite runner, you can be an elite runner. If you just put in the work and give up these things to, do these horseback riding expeditions, you'll be able to do it. If you just make sure you're only eating 500 calories a day, then you'll be faster. And I think it really showed that slow burn of how Keith really got these people under his thumb.
And he did it through Claire. So he leveraged Claire's influence over Sylvie. I think it was a smart person to start with. Even at the time, I was like, I don't know how this is going to come off. You will notice the people that are still loyal never bring that one up. And that's a married woman, right?
She was also someone I had personally never heard of before the trial. So I thought that was interesting as well. And obviously, you guys are key players and know everyone else who is key players just from being inside at the time. But she was someone who, of all the people I had talked to, she was never brought up to me.
Obviously, I think, we were cornered into a situation. We were forced to say something as quasi leaders of what we thought we were building. But for her, she was never someone in that. And for her to step out of her comfort zone and really an international stage and do what she did, to me was, I'm not going to say braver than what we did, but I can imagine it because she had overcome so much of her own personal.
It was harder, probably.
Harder for her to do that and to be the first person and to deliver in the way that she delivered. Speaks volumes about her and who she is and her husband, who is a good friend of mine as well.
We're so proud of both of them.
Yeah.
She seemed like a person who could have very easily chosen to not speak up, and no one would have expected her to speak up. So I think, and that's just my interpretation.
No, you're right.
From,
Absolutely.
not knowing her on a personal level. But that's how it came off, I think, in her testimony.
Yeah, it was surprising for her. I mean, I knew her well enough and I knew her character well enough to know that she checks out my box in spades, but to want to go out and be in a position to expose your deepest embarrassment, was, I didn't know that she had that into her, even though I'm not surprised. It was also just a wow, I can't believe she did that. But yeah, that was out of the gates pretty damning.
I also think, just my last point on her testimony, and Sarah, I don't know if this is something that you can relate to, but I'm a person who, if I have a goal, I work really hard to get to that goal. And if you tell me I can't do it, you better believe I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do it 2 times better than you thought I was going to do it in the first place. And with her testimony, with her running and her horseback riding, I felt like I could kind of connect with that a little bit. Like I could kind of in her necessarily, but it's kind of that moment where you're like, okay, again, these are not weak people who are being
Correct.
brought into this. These are strong and determined people who Keith has targeted in these things. And I think for me, there was at least a little bit of a personal connection there where I was like, okay, like I get this.
Yeah, I think your impression is accurate. Sylvia is that person.
So what did you guys think overall about season 2?
I've had some time to think about it. We, as you both know, we broke down each episode right after we watched it in real time live on Vimeo for our Patreon listeners. And at first, like my mother and people close to us were like, maybe that's not a good idea. That's going to be re-traumatizing. It was actually helpful because we got to watch and then process, mind you, with like 150 people, but we got to process before I would only get being able to sleep because I would have just been lying in bed processing. So being able to talk about it with people after the fact was really helpful. I thought the filmmakers did a great job. I was very proud to be a part of it. I thought it's really rare in the cult series space, of which there are many these days, to have access to the footage that they had, the archival footage. And I thought they did a really brilliant job of pulling the key points of a 6-week trial and putting it into a 6-hour docuseries. That being said, there's a lot missing we can get to later. And I don't feel like upset with them that they didn't include it. I know that they were limited time-wise and they had constraints from the network. There's a term in filmmaking, it's awful, called kill your babies. They had to cut out a lot. And I know that it's terrible. I wish there was another way to say it.
It's a term in news
Is it too? Okay.
So
Can we just call it editing?
They had to edit out a lot of things I know they wanted to keep. Some people have asked, like, what would season 3 be? Which I know there won't be. But if there was, you could do a whole season just on what happened in Mexico, for example. And we're hoping to have some of the key leaders in Mexico come on as future guests, FYI, to our listeners. Get excited about that. Fingers crossed. But overall, I mean, there's like my personal journey with it. It did bring up a lot of things that I didn't, like I kind of thought I was over, but also was meaningful to see, for example, like what was happening behind the scenes, which we had heard about or we could speculate, you know. I had heard that Nancy, for example, was playing my voicemail to people as proof of why I had, like, you know, proof of my craziness. So to see her play it for the filmmakers and then like hear it, I haven't heard it since I left it. You know, I left that message in June of 2017, like the week I left, when I hadn't heard from her or whatever that was. Like, I'm pretty sure it was June. So to hear it again, you know, kind of put me back into that spot of like, what the fuck, Nancy? You're supposed to be my bonus mom and you're not even calling me to see if I'm okay or not. Like, what is happening here? And so like, I didn't realize that would like trigger such a response in my body that I had thought I'd kind of worked through. And I was also, you know, the whole arc of episode 1 to 6 is very different, which is why I'm glad we're kind of recapping this in one episode, because if you'd interviewed me after episode 1, you would have found me quite, riled up. Like, you know, we hear Nancy saying things, I think it was episode 2, like that she's more mad at me than Keith. And like, that's just crazy knowing what we know now. And I remember talking to Jahan, the director, and being like, I feel like you guys kind of got swept up in Nancy's shtick. Like, you see Nancy doing her shtick, you know, her introduction of herself and her story and who she is. We've heard that a bazillion times. And that's not hyperbolic. It was for sure a bazillion times that we heard her story of how she got into NXIVM, how she met Keith. And I feel like she was doing that to the filmmakers. I'm like, oh my gosh, she conned them too, you know, but she reminded me that there's a story arc and there's she's like, wait till the end. And I'm glad I waited to the end because I think that we all had, you know, went on that emotional journey with Nancy as she starts to reconcile, which is kind of my main key thing that I gleaned from this series that I think is really important is you see somebody unwinding, deprogramming, unbrainwashing, whatever you want to call it, in real time. And I don't think I've never seen that in a series, and Nippy and I have watched, again, a bazillion cult documentaries. So I think is a real gift. And I've got lots of other little things to say, but to answer your overarching question, I really felt like the filmmakers brought dignity to everybody, to all the survivors, all the victims, even those who are still loyal. You know, if anything, I feel like I wanted to hear more pushback. I wanted to hear the filmmakers say, I know that you think that the women agreed to this, but we have this audio of Keith saying otherwise. Like, how do you reconcile that? Like, there's things that I wanted. If I was in the room, I would have been like, but what about this? And I don't know if that was happening because we weren't there. So yeah, it was an emotional journey overall. I'm really, really happy with it. I wish there was a season 3 to cover all the things that were missed, but that's my rough sketch.
I'm totally fine with no season 3. I do think there's a little bit of context to add to that, just because in speaking with the directors, producers, as they were going through the editing process, and we didn't shoot anything past 2019. Except maybe a couple B-rolls of stuff at home, finding out news or whatever. They had a lot to deal with, and it could have easily been, I think, 9 to 10 episodes. And I think they were They were pressured to get it down to 6. They had to delete Mexico stuff. They had people drop out at the last minute. So I think for them, from what I've ascertained, is the best course of action was to focus on Nancy, because I think it showed someone who was right next to the villain. And how did that person make it okay? And I think in seeing how someone who, depending on what you think of Nancy, she's smart to a certain extent, and how does someone fall for that? And that seemed to be the best course of action, from dealing with people who were constantly in trauma, people who were still reconciling their delusion, and people who had been sexually abused. I know from talking to producers, directors, it's like, I spoke to Kareem, he's like, he doesn't want to touch anything with sexual trauma ever again. It was really difficult. And Sarah and I weren't targeted in that way. And we were able to talk about it because we were more peripheral and because we had less trauma going on. And so the season 2 was chocked full of people that were going through that. And I think it was challenging for them. And I think having Nancy emerge as the person to kind of demonstrate the arc of unwinding, and then maybe with some of the people that hadn't reconciled, who had found out, was the best course of action. I think, to Sarah's point, I would have liked to seen a little bit more pushback, but I also feel like the people that would have been pushed back on would have just bailed, because I think they need to feel safe, and they have their conditions of what they think is ethical and and your process is always flawed if you're going to challenge them. So they had to do something to ingratiate themselves to them to get the story. And the story, I think, is hard to capture because you have everyone who's in trauma, and the people who were in the less trauma were no longer the focal point of the doc. So I think they did the best they could in doing it. And am I happy with it? It kind of came and went quickly for me for a lot of reasons. We were in our own apartment that wasn't ours. I was middle of long days with our kids driving in football season. So it was really just a Monday night. We were going to do this, and I was going to do it, and then do it in a way that, I didn't want it to take too much of my RAM and my bandwidth. And all that said, it was triggering to find out all the things that were going on. This goes for season 1 and season 2. To see his persona, call it off stage, right? Because we were peripheral, we would see him when we came to town. I didn't know what a dick he was. Like, what a real fucking asshole that guy was, where the cameras were rolling, but off stage to everyone. Like, I was like, is that how he fucking was? Like
laying around on the couch,
laying
having
around,
women
getting,
fawn on him.
what the fuck's going on here? Was this going on the whole time? So I had a little bit of that, and, a little bit of re-traumatizing and my embarrassment for following and being, hook, line, and sinker with this guy. And then I really got in tune when I first heard his voice in an episode, and it was that I wish that people, the soft faux compassion, it was really interesting to see how quickly that I felt the disarmament that I would feel towards any sort of like, this guy's fine, because he spoke softly. I really got in tune with, shit, that's what got me. Like, if I did have doubt, I would see the soft persona and I would project innocence into it. I wouldn't think that, that he was off stage doing all that stuff. And I found, for me, I didn't realize this till I saw season 2. It's like, that's where I got disarmed. Like, that's where I really got to, like, when I see any sort of like what I perceive as compassion or softness, my doubts are immediately kind of put on hold, and I'm like, I'm not going to punch down, or I'm not going to be mean to something like that. And I think he understood that.
Totally, he did.
And I think he understood how to disarm people.
It's so interesting that those feelings still come up for you too, even though you know everything you know now, and to see him through this lens, that still kind of comes up. I
got enraged when I heard it. I was like, that motherfucker, that's what he was doing the whole time.
Do you remember in The Source, which the documentary doesn't cover, The Source is the whole acting program. He taught us that there's the alphabet of
the constellation.
Yeah, a constellation of the physical mannerisms that one puts together to express a certain thing. For example, if somebody wanted to convey and leave an impression of compassion, that one would speak in a certain way and tilt their head in a certain way and use their hands in a certain way and look at you. People can't see us right now. And now looking back, like even his whole shtick around how he spoke and how he pontificated in the forums, which Nippy nailed in his impression of him, which is a bonus content over on Patreon, by the way, just to get people over there to watch. It is amazing. And Nippy's so good because he basically mimics the physical things that now I know Keith is doing to give the impression of somebody who is wise, who is humble, who is down to earth and can share life's deepest, most important values and lessons. Like those are things he studied people doing in the world and then copied, right? Including that voice. That's why I bring it up.
And all of those things too, I feel like in every podcast episode, you guys kind of reveal a little bit more about Keith and a little bit more of these little nuggets. And when you talk about them, one at a time, they might not seem like they build this mastermind, but then when you take them all and you put them together, you can see how he manipulated smart people like Nancy to kind of do his bidding. Like he knows what he's doing the entire time.
Because you don't have that in your psychology, I'm assuming you don't. You're not going to project that this guy's. That's the last thing I think someone would be doing this, particularly when they've built an organization that seeks to build that into the world. The element of surprise and getting people asleep at the wheel around his abuse, I think, was his skill set. And I think he studied it. I had pictures of athletes and leaders on my wall growing up. I think he studied psychopaths because he figured out that he was one, and he figured out I'm not going to function in society until I figure out how human beings work so I can manipulate them. I think that's the psychology you're dealing with. And I think there's a lot more of them out there.
Right. I mean, just between myself and some other journalists who I'm friends with who covered it, I mean, just evil is the word that consistently comes up. It's manipulative, but it's intentional and it's evil.
There's a John Lennon quote. Yeah, I think he was on Dick Cavett's show, like back in the late 70s. And he said something to the effect of, I believe the world is run by maniacal people with maniacal intent. And I was like 28 or 29 when I read that. And I was like, what a fucking cynical way to look at it from a guy who wrote Imagine. I just thought those two belief systems living within yourself was, I remember thinking it was cynical at the time. But if you look at some of the adversity that John Lennon had to face, FBI had a file on him because he put out the message of peace. I think that was dangerous to people that wanted to squash that. And I think he probably had a crash course on what that looks like. And that was his conclusion. So until you've had an experience of those dark forces that you don't think are there, and you put a lot of faith into our systems and our society, until you get some pushback and you recognize, holy shit, that's a pretty dark force that's going on, it starts to make sense how that can be. And just look at what's going on right now in the world. You can see that there's some of those things in the background pulling levers, and it's hard to figure out who and what because it comes in the package of someone like Keith. And you're pretty unassuming to the thing that might be abusing you. And that's what I think this podcast, I hope to achieve, is just informing people that this, I'm not going to say is always out there, but it could be. And the thing that you put your faith in or you trust into might have some maniacal people behind it, not necessarily a maniacal intent. I think a lot of things at the grassroots level are altruistic. I think higher up the food chain you get, if you don't have checks and balances at the highest level, kind of end up being that way after time. And if you have this knowledge and you're armed with it, you know what it looks like and sounds like. We collectively who aren't maniacal, because it doesn't take a lot of maniacal minds to abuse a system, can hold those forces in check best we can. And until we come up with a better modality to do that, our podcast hopefully can contribute to that.
This is the golden age of cult recovery. The more we speak up and share our stories, the more we realize we are not alone. Your voice and your story can empower others. This is Sarah, and I'm proud to be a founding collaborator of the #IGotOut movement. Learn more at igotout.org.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Did you guys want to talk about episodes
Sure.
specifically?
Yeah.
Let's go episode by episode. I have notes that we took at the time.
Okay.
Again, if people want like a more detailed response, it's on Patreon. People sign up at the flying monkey level. So episode 1.
That moment when kind of Nancy comes into the frame and sits down, for me, when I saw that, I was kind of like, okay, like, here we go. Like, my bullshit radar is going off. Like, I'm taking everything that she's going to say in this moment with a grain of salt. So there's that. And then you also see a lot of, Mark Agnifilo preparing for the case and going to talk to Keith and talking about what Keith is saying to him and all of these things. So, I mean, I feel like that, obviously, I don't want to speak for you guys. I feel like that was triggering for me to see, knowing what I know, and it must have been even more so for you guys. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think if you put yourself into the mind of those people, it makes sense. To a lesser extent, because I didn't do any crimes. I wasn't not forthright with people that enrolled. I didn't do anything really per se bad, except just make a bad decision. And from my perspective, just looked a little stupid for 10, 12 years, right? So that's kind of was my thing. And in sharing my story, the impulse to not look stupid of self-preservation is always something I'm trying to keep in check, right? Because I think that compromised the authenticity of my message. So I'm on this journey now of being a slave to the story. And in doing so, I'm going to have to be stupid looking, the con that I looked for. And that's difficult. Now, hers is 20, 30 plus years. So I knew first things out of her mouth aren't going to be, I did this thing and taking the responsibility. I think her reconciliation is still going on in prison. And the impulse to preserve your self-image is always going to be there because you don't want to go, yeah, I did this. Yeah, I did this. Yeah, I did this. And I was like, because it was this. And I wanted to preserve the company. I was making money like that. That's not going to be the first things out of her mouth. So I understood that. That said, when she came in and was talking, I'm more mad at Sarah, to me, that is indicative of her character and everything that was driving her. Like in the face of abuse, I don't care. There's still what I'm getting out of this. This organization still serves me. I'm not serving it the way I'm pretending it is. And those all things just revered her character to me as I saw it at that time. As for Agnifilo, he's a lawyer. In a lot of ways, he's a businessman. And he understands that if I have an angle here to get my client off, that's going to help me down the road. And if I can get someone off who may even look totally guilty, that speaks to my acumen and what I'm good. And that's the way the system's designed and it's set up for his success. So in the same way that, he may pretend he's a lawyer for humanity, there's a system that serves him and what he's going to do. And that's the way the system's set up. And there's always going to be someone who's going to go in and be like, hey, I'll do this for this amount of money. And if I can do it, and then unfortunately, evidence came out where he was in a bind with like, okay, now I'm defending a guy who's a pedophile and a rapist. And that kind of comes with the territory.
Yeah. And I mean, like, someone's got to be a defense attorney. A lot of people have to be defense attorneys when it comes down to it. I think people, especially kind of in the heat of a lot of it, forgot that, he's just there doing his job. I don't know him personally. I only know him in that job. So it's tough to remember that, though, when there's emotion attached to it.
I didn't remember it when it was going on. Like, I can watch it 3 or 4 years later and with that hindsight, and I'm out of it and have that perspective. But when it was going on, like, he was gunning for Sarah and I at first until he recognized he was dealing with a lot of way more egregious acts. So, I don't like the system. Right. But it's the best one we have, like it or not. And he's the guy that's going to be in it. And it doesn't make it right. But, that's how the lens I had to watch it. And I hate that exists and all that stuff. But I'm not changing it right now. I'm changing things in the way that I can change it through informing. That's kind of my take on it.
For sure. Sarah?
We saw a lot of Agnifilo take a lot of shit social, like on our Patreon, like people just being like, forgetting that is his job. And I actually heard Moira Penza speak about him in another podcast about how, and I didn't actually know this, that even after the fact, you can't disparage your client. Even when the trial's over, you can't, say, oh, I was wrong and he's a shithead or whatever.
Well, that's bad for business too.
It is bad for business, but there's a code of ethics around that, which I didn't know. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but she did say, even though there's that's in place, she was surprised with, and this is more sort of in the arc of the whole series, surprised with how much it seemed as though he had bought in, fully bought in and fully like was on board and seemed to have been head fucked by Keith, for lack of a better word, and bought into the narrative. And, you know, another great example of how anyone can fall for it. Like, but we don't know. We don't know how much he fell for it, or he's just really doing his job as the lawyer. We can't say.
I think it's the latter.
Really just doing his job?
Yeah, I do.
I think by the end he came to terms
Yeah.
with it, but I think there was a time in the middle where he was like, no, it was consensual and, you know, these women chose. But then I think when you get the underage stuff in, that's where he was like, yeah, I can't really do much about that for you. But you
Supporting that's
saved
bad
your
for
text
business.
messages. Yeah, remember he was like, he
Right.
saved his text messages. He saved his text messages. He downloaded his WhatsApp messages to his computer. Right? That comes later.
When he's talking about those downloads of text messages, I feel like that is like a moment that from some other defense attorneys who I do know on, you know, separate cases, it's kind of like that, are you kidding me moment where you kind of have to go back to your client and be like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, you saved this evidence that is damning to you. And then just backing up a little bit, I don't think it would be surprising to anyone if Keith did try to manipulate his own lawyer as well. I mean, that's what he does. He does it with everyone. So why would he stop there? You know, whether it worked or not, I don't know if we'll ever know that, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he didn't try to do that.
That's true. And I would love to, I don't think we'll be allowed to, but I'd love to interview him one day. That would be fun. To put that on the list. Agnifilo. What do we used to call him when I couldn't remember his name? There was a name for him.
Snuffleupagus.
Snuffleupagus, yeah. Snuffleupagus. Yeah, anyway. My other thoughts about episode 1, and I think this was episode 1, I'm pretty sure, and but also throughout the whole series, it was how, I think it was Nancy who was like looking at him and gazing at him. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, she was so in love with him. And there were so many behind the scenes clips that I thought, like, if I had seen that, I knew that she respected him in the way that she edified him and like would pump his tires before he came on stage or whatever. But I never saw her looking at him like that. And to see that behind the scenes footage was like, I mean, it was nauseating and also filled in some gaps. And not just her. There was some, Karen was looking at him like that. Lauren was looking at him like that.
The way you did that, I know your listeners can't see it, but the way you put your head in your chin in your hand like that, and she would sit there like that, just staring at him. It looks like almost like what you would imagine like a schoolgirl crush to be.
Absolutely. There was also some really incredible editing, an audio with Keith and Allison Mack pushing on her fears around being like rejected and being like ousted from society, and then intercut with her arrest. That was episode 1, right?
Yeah. And intercutting with the worst thing happening in her real life.
Yeah. And this is something that like the audience wouldn't know unless you were in the training. Like a lot of the EMs or the explorations were like, what's the worst thing? Like if you had a fear, you really push on like, what is the worst possible thing? And the idea would be that like, if you really thought about it, A, it would be very unlikely that that worst thing would happen. And B, even if the worst thing happened, that you'd be okay. That like your essence, like even if you were in jail for the rest of your life, you could survive like Nelson Mandela, you know, like it was that kind of like principle-based thought exploration in your head. But to see him talk about the worst possible thing and then that happening to her, and then wondering how much did he set her up for that? You know, because he talked about and has talked about and says there's lots of evidence of this. He wanted to break her. He wanted to break her pride. And he did that.
I don't think anything he did was unintentional. I don't think any of the people he picked to bring around him were unintentional. You know, he built this close circle intentionally. And I think each person, this is obviously just my perspective from the outside, each person had a very specific role. And he was manipulating them in a way so he could fit them in those slots and, you know, get his overall evil or even more.
Totally agree.
One more thing just on episode 1, and as a Moira Penza stan, but she is just, to see her in action again and kind of the behind the scenes in action, it brought me back to being in the courtroom and seeing her do that work. And I wish there had been a way to video record that so people could see it, because she was really just a force in that courtroom.
I wish I'd seen that. I mean, I know how I felt I think I spent 2.5 days with her and the team back in the first round of witness interviewing. And, you know, I rolled in like jeans and a sweater. She was in head to toe power suit, Prada heels, like every day. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that people like in this space would dress so great and be so hot. Like in addition to being such a powerhouse, like the combination of those things, the irony is not lost on me that this is Keith's type of woman, petite brunette, coming in and just destroying him daily.
Just the poise she had in the courtroom too. I mean, she was never flustered. She was never rushing. Everything was fascinating to watch in action. I wish there was more of that, but I'm glad that they kind of had her talk through it in some of those interviews, because I still think you get the sense of just the poise she carries herself with.
Could not agree more. I think this line was also episode 1. Back to Agnifilo for a second. He said something about KR didn't need a cult to get action. Yeah, that's exactly what he needed. And I don't know if we've mentioned this on the pod before, but somebody reached out to us when the news broke who he dated for not a long time, but this is before NXIVM. And she shared with me that he tried to get her to sign a contract saying that she wouldn't date anybody else. And like, here's the deal with dating him, and that he was going to be with other people, but she couldn't date anybody else. And it was a contract. And she was like, I'm not signing that contract. This is before NXIVM. So he's been trying to do shit like this, trying to lock down loyalty, lock down his harem, lock down, having access to multiple women.
That's the argument you make when you're pretending all it's about is sex.
Right.
Right? It wasn't about that for him. It was about dominating them. It was about owning them. It was about having them be submissive to him. And those are all the things that are the coercive control aspect from it. So a response of like, well, if it was about sex, I could pay for it. And there's certainly people that could pay for it. Well, that's him deflecting, because if he actually explains what it's really about, we can just roll the tape if we want to know what it's really about. And that's a hard thing for most people to project into another person, that they would go to those lengths to dominate and humiliate another person. So his modus operandi, whatever you want to call it, is to humiliate, dominate, and own. And that's a pretty hard thing to prove unless you have footage of him actually saying it. I think I heard Robert Gavin say Keith's worst enemy was Keith in this trial. I think to a certain extent, people like that just lose touch because it's the emperor has no clothes. They lose so much touch with the morality of the world because they bent it so much that when the morality of the world kind of crashes in on them, they don't recognize it as that anymore. They don't recognize that their behaviors are reprehensible to most of the world.
Egregious.
And for good reason.
It's like he created this alternate reality where everything that he ever wanted was okay.
Yes.
In his kind of fucked up view of the world.
And nobody held him accountable. And that was actually like a bone that we've heard needs to be picked. And I feel the same way, that the series didn't cover any of the Times Union coverage, or like hold it up to Nancy's face saying, how could you, like, you didn't know, but like there was a whole expose in the Times Union. That being said, I remember when that happened, and that had already been preempted by a bunch of bullshit curriculum talking about when you're noble and you're changing the world, they're going to push back and call you the worst thing. What's the worst thing someone could call you? A pedophile. Then this news thing comes out and we're like, oh, there it is. They're trying to destroy us. It's a smear campaign. So I remember when that happened, and I understand how she dismissed it, but I also feel like that needs to be in the series, or needed to be in the series.
Yeah. Just one question about, you mentioned the Times Union previous coverage. Do you happen to remember when that was coming out? Did the knife already exist?
No, 2012 is when it came out, and the knife started to be developed. What would that be, like 2014? 13 or 14? Yeah, 14 maybe.
Yeah, you were pregnant.
Okay.
I was pregnant with Troy when Ultima was being developed. That's a good point.
Which
and
is
I think
why
that
you
actually
couldn't
saved
be,
me.
Yeah, I think so. You couldn't be
I
near
think that
Keith.
saved me. I was supposed to be in the Ultima acting development group. I was, but like remotely, because I had to get back to Vancouver to give birth, which was being pushed to me to stay in the U.S. to give birth.
Well, it makes sense why I wasn't chosen for those developmental teams too.
Nippy was so pissed.
Keith didn't want me around.
No, he did not want you. I remember, because it's a quick tangent, a little nugget for our audience. When they developed Ultima, a bunch of people came to Albany to like start these new companies. And we knew there was going to be an acting one and a media one. That was the knife. And like a fitness one, that'd be XOSO. And then we were like, we filled out this intake form, like what interests you and what's your background. Nippy played college football, okay? He's the strongest athlete in the whole organization, okay? I'm gonna pump your tires for a second.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah.
Pump away and I'll add more context.
Well, the point is that you had a lot of skill sets to be in a number of different groups, not just that one.
Yeah.
It was obvious that I'd be in the acting group because I have a bachelor of fuck all in theater performance, and all those at BFA. So anyway, then when the people were chosen for the groups, and like Nippy wasn't chosen to be in the development group for any of them. None of them. And we were like, what the fuck?
It isn't even like I was such a good athlete. That's not really like what it was. There was no one else there that competed like in anything. So it's a glaring omission. Like, it's not so much like my skill. It was like, there was no one else who did it. There was no one else who like trained in the off season.
Only Keith could be the East Coast judo champion and have a high IQ.
God.
And he's the only one who could be good at all the things.
Right.
It makes total sense why I wasn't.
Now it
around
makes
there
total
now.
sense. But even like the group that was supposed to be looking at media, or like some of the people that were chosen were like super low ranking level. Like if the ranking system had any merit, that Nippy, a proctor, first of all, so orange sash, would have been in charge of or leading one of those groups. They had all these like, whatever. Now it makes
But
sense.
it just makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense now.
Of course you don't want me around.
I'm going to brand your wife and put him in my harem. You better get the
Jesus.
fuck out of town, Anthony.
Well, also, like, we spoke to some people who are around during the developmental stuff. It's hard to hide your behavior from like 20 developmental groups of 5 to 10 people. And I think who Keith was starting to seep out into the people that weren't as indoctrinated as in a circle. Because remember, we would hear some stuff, Sarah, that like he was keeping them up late at night. We thought all the stuff that was going on in those developmental groups was really weird. And Sarah and I finally were like, God, thank God we're not fucking doing any of that. Because they were meeting at midnight, shit like that.
He didn't put people in those who were going to question him.
Right.
That was probably
That's
intentional.
what I think happened.
And all the women, for example, that were chosen to do XOSO were all women he was trying to have sex with or, fuck with mentally. Anyway, back to season 2 debrief.
Yeah. So episode 2 kind of gives us more of an inside scoop from Nancy. I think we're really kind of getting into the interviews with her there, but she's still very much in the mode there where she's defending his work, and she's saying, there's however many thousand people out there who thought this was good, like where are they? And she's still very much in that mindset. And Sarah, I think we were texting a little bit during this, and I was like, I don't know if I can watch this. Like, it is just all still peddling these ideas that we already have convicted Keith of. So like, why are we hearing this? And I think, it goes back to that arc that you mentioned earlier, but were you still feeling that way during episode 2?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably one of the things that was most challenging at the time, is knowing what I know now. And, she's knowing even as that was airing, I know that she's in prison. Like if she wasn't in prison, it would be different. Like if she was running free and still EMing people and whatever, I would have been probably more pissed off. But it was hard to watch, especially when she's talking shit about me. And this is somebody who I've never reconciled with. Like there's people that have left, who are out, who stayed way longer than they should have and have apologized. A lot of this would be different if I had had that with her, like I'd had with Lauren. Lauren, how I feel towards Lauren was very different. But at this stage, episode 2, I mean, I wrote, my notes say fucking liar, So like she's saying that was a separate company and DOS was a separate thing. Like by episode 6, we know that she knows that that's not true, because like DOS was basically the same thing as what was happening in the harem of Keith's harem before DOS was even a thing. It's the same thing. It was just more like codified.
Yeah, she's still in self-preservation mode.
That's hard to watch.
I think it's hard. And this is, I think only something that I came to think about recently. And after watching, the entire season, it's got to be, and I'm not being a Nancy apologist by any way, shape, or form, so I hope it doesn't come off that way. It's got to be really difficult to come to terms with all of the bad things that she let happen and helped happen and did to her daughter. And that's got to be something really hard to within like your own heart and mind.
This is where I think the filmmakers had a hard task. And did they achieve it? I think in part. And I think I saw it in an interview with Shahan. It's like, it's easy to pile on someone like that. And that's the natural impulse. But can you show how someone gets to the point that they get to? And do we have a society where she can redeem herself, and if she wants to? And, the way you redeem yourself is I think you have to own your participation in whatever it was, and then do the best to build back what was potentially destroyed. In her case, it's time for a lot of people, because a lot of people made major life decisions to go spend their time. You can't bring people's time back. It's the one commodity. And I think the biggest crime that Keith committed to people is taking their time based on a lie. I think there's certain trauma you can come back from, maybe not entirely, but time is something that you got to eat that. If I let myself go to a place, the time that I gave up, valuable years where people are building themselves and building what they want to, what kind of person they want to build, building their families, building their lives. He took that away from a lot of people, me less so than most of them, but still I get a little pissed when I let myself go there. So, and she was a perpetrator of that. So I don't know how you come back from that.
To add another level of that, I think the subset of that worst crime specifically is taking away women's time of their fertile years.
Inclusive.
Yeah. Just to really punch that point. And that comes in the later episodes.
And her own daughters. So, yeah.
Like when people ask, like, overall, what did I think of season 2? I also have a huge amount of grief for people like Lauren, who lost her childbearing years to this fuck nugget. That's a weight that I feel heavily as a friend and as a participant in this community.
And especially the fact, that Nancy, her mother, was those childbearing years away from her. No matter what angle you look at it from, it's got to be hard for Nancy to reconcile with it. It's got to be hard for Lauren to forgive her mom. For you, as someone who's kind of on this journey of maybe moving towards forgiveness with Lauren, it's got to be hard for you to do the same for Nancy, because she's helped take away this thing from someone who was your best friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was hard.
Also in episode 2 was kind of when we started to see witnesses come to the stand. Nippy, we already talked about it a little bit, but Sylvie was the first witness, and then Mark was on the stand after. And I think his testimony, and I can't remember if they got into this in the episode, but his testimony really helped with the fact, that those tapes were tampered with. And I feel like that was a big point that they made during that.
And that was the first time I had heard that, and I didn't know any of that was going on. So it kind of braced me for what else is going on that I didn't. And then it made me think that, like, if he was doing that, what were other people closer to Keith and just more blind than Mark was doing? Because I don't think it's just something you do once. It's kind of like when you catch someone stealing from the till. If you have a business, it's not the first time they did it, right? So I think that's just kind of a pattern of that behavior. Convenience ethics.
Right.
Hey there, listener. Hope you're enjoying this episode and that you're taking deep breaths when we cover the enraging stuff that cult jerks are up to. Let it out, as in the yoga practice. Inhale positivity, exhale negativity. That's for you, Sarah. We got this. No hulking it out, all you little hulksters. And if you need some helpful resources on the topic of cult recovery, check out our website at alittlebitculty.com. And now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga. Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like, I'm in Vancouver right now, and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. Hashtag cold pools, hashtag crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me, and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it, and I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty.
So episode 3 was really interesting to me because I knew about kind of the Tourette's experiment and I knew about Mark Elliott, but I didn't know about Isabella and her story. And so the fact that they really delved deep into that, I thought was fascinating. And I'd love to hear from you guys. How big was this kind of experiment on curing Tourette's? And again, your audience can't see me, but that's in air quotes, the cure of Tourette's. Was that a really big part of NXIVM at the time?
It was towards the end, yeah. We actually thought that the movie would vindicate us. Like, oh, just like we thought Richard Branson endorsing NXIVM, which he didn't really, but they said that he did. We thought this video of how we, quote unquote, cured Tourette's would really change the public perception because it's proof. Like, if we can cure Tourette's, then we can cure anything, really, because Tourette's was just the bigger manifestation of what everybody struggles with, is how they were pitching it. That's not what I believe. But to watch it, I mean, my only criticism, and I've heard this from some experts as well, there was a little caveat in the tiny print saying the study was not peer reviewed and was not like a proper study or whatever. I think there may be some people that would watch it going, oh my God, but they did cure Tourette's. Like, no, they helped a handful of people. There was a lot of people that didn't get helped, and also like people like Isabella, who, by the way, our audiences want to know how she's doing. We're hoping to get her on the podcast soon as we have legal permission. But it was really hard for her because a lot of people, when they realized what was actually going on, they went backwards. Like, Mark is still apparently cured, and you can't tell that he has or had Tourette's, but like a lot of people's tics came back when they weren't under the watch of the NXIVM leadership. And the feedback that we've gotten is that they were basically like threatened into not ticking and like had, for lack of a better word, fear of God in them, that like they were going to ruin the study if they ticked. So like that to me wasn't really shown properly. But I think it's also like one of the things I love about season 1 and season 2 of The Vow is that it's a nuanced, not beating you over the head with the like, you know, the facts and experts. And like, yes, they could have had experts in to explain this, but I think that an audience watching can go through the experience with us of going, oh, wow, like this is why we thought it was good. Do you know what I mean? So to have like a more of a experiential.
I have a somewhat different perspective on that.
Sure.
I think they could have showed what we thought it was and then hammered the delusion of what was going on.
That's a good point.
Because it still leaves wiggle room for people who are delusional to cling to something and cling to some sort of hope. I did a Google search of Tourette studies and stuff like that, and it's a superficial Google search. If you're serious about thinking you have something that can help Tourette's, you take what you did to a peer review or you take it somewhere, and if you have something, experts will ascertain that. There's no interest in that. So it just tells me that really the Tourette's mission is self-serving more so than it is about helping people with Tourette's. But you can always say it's about helping people with Tourette's and maintain your belief that Keith Raniere is the mastermind behind this, which is the delusion. And I think that episode could have really just brought in some experts, done a superficial Google search, so this has been done before, and laid that to rest. Because what it allows is someone like Mark, and I worked with Mark. I thought I didn't have any problem with Mark. But the behaviors that are coming out right now in order to maintain your belief are borderline mean. And people are becoming vitriolic and antagonistic towards other people that don't agree with their narrative and aren't obedient to it. And I think experts objectively could have come in and just hammered it, put it to rest, and sent them on their way. That's how I think it should have done. I think that's where the filmmakers, in trying to extend dignity to everyone, which they do, but at a certain point, when they're not getting the dignified behavior in return, you need to hold a line and a boundary, and that the boundary and line is in upholdance of the human team, so to speak. So I wasn't there. I wasn't there for the decisions. I just think, sometimes, you just got to treat stupid people as though they're stupid. No, I mean, really.
The thing is, Mark's not
stupid, but he's acting stupid. And, we got our reality. The universe treats you how you are, not how you're pretending to be. And I think the universe is always right, and we got ours. And we're turning it into something positive. And Mark needs to start doing that himself. And someone needs to get in his ear and tell him that. It needs to be an expert. It can't be us. So while that might sound a little bit mean and harsh, I think that's what that Tourette's episode was missing.
No, I agree with you on that.
Important to remember when people are watching The Vow, again, this isn't like your local
Right.
news station or even your national news station. Like, they also have a story
sure.
to tell. So they can kind of choose to show the other side or not choose to show the other side depending on kind of where they're directed to go. So I think that's important to remember when people are watching
Yeah.
it as well. And something that I also had to keep reminding myself when I was watching it. And I was like, well, what about this, and this that shows the other side of it? And then I had to remember, well, there's no journalistic law that says they have to show these things. So I have to be okay with the story that they've decided to tell, I guess.
Yeah, you know that as a journalist. So I'm not telling you anything, but yeah, that's a good point. You have a journalistic point of view, but then you also have they're telling a documentary point of view.
And the whole like other side thing, there was no time for me ever in this showing the other side that I thought that people would go, oh, you're right. Branding would be a good way to have female empowerment. Keith had a good point there. Like there was no other side-ness to this, except for with the Tourette's that could give people an impression that Tourette's was cured, which I think was dangerous. I guess because I know that I didn't have that impression. I think the thing that was the strongest with that interaction was watching Mark Elliott clearly gaslight Isabella. And that was like, not only did he sound like Keith, but it was so upsetting. And also I'm cheering for Isabella being so fucking strong and being like, yeah, no, this is why I'm leaving. And there's moments where Mark's like, well, if that was true, that would be assault. I'm like, no shit, Mark. That's what it was. Similarly to Nippy, I cared for Mark. I still do care for Mark. If he called me and said, hey, shit, I'm sorry, I'd welcome him back with open arms. But the fact that he's still touting the party line is upset. It's still upsetting.
Yeah. I also love the story of Isabella in there because I feel like it almost creates this Tourette's episode almost creates this smaller version of NXIVM as a whole. And you kind of get this like little piece of it that shows everything that was going on. And this little piece of it was going on in the bigger scheme of it as well. And I thought that was, and I don't know if, the average viewer got that or just if you know enough about it. I don't know how that comes across to other people, but that's how I felt about it. I was like, this is this little nucleus and it's showing exactly what happens and, all these other parts of NXIVM and then also NXIVM as a whole.
Yeah.
In the world.
Yeah. For sure.
One quick thing about episode 3. This is when we're first introduced to Diane Benscotter, who will be,
oh yes,
I believe if I got the timeline right, our next guest. We interviewed Diane Benscotter, and it's the moment that I gleaned from that was that's clear from the beginning, and I think this may have changed, but Nancy doesn't respect her. It seems like, it looks like anyway, that she's like, okay, I'll do this for the vow or like for whatever, but like, because we'd all been trained that therapy was bullshit, right? Only path was NXIVM, and I felt like watching her that she was like, okay, episode 4.
This was kind of the moment where I was seeing Nancy maybe start to wake up a little bit and kind of start to maybe take a little bit more responsibility. And I think she has a long way to go, obviously, but would you guys agree that was kind of the start of what we began to see?
I for sure did. I think what Lauren did may have been a pretty important step or precursor into facilitating that.
Yeah, the only note that I have from episode 4 was Lauren and the comment about roughhousing. And I know we've already talked about just the tragedy of what Keith did to people like Lauren, but and holding back the promise of the baby and how cruel that was, but also just the double standard of it not being okay for Lauren to roughhouse. And I don't know if we've ever talked about this, Nippy, but like Keith was doing that with people all the time, physically, like, even like how they showed in one of the episodes where Keith was like videotape me doing my tumbling, like he was doing stuff like that and like getting physical and sort of like wrestling with people. And it's inappropriate. Like I shared with Nippy before we got on with you. I remembered when I was going over my notes, he used to do that thing where you come up from somebody from behind and like hold them and then crack their back. Have you ever done that? Has someone ever done that for you? First of all, that's not like a safe chiropractic move. You should never let somebody other than a chiropractor crack your back. So that's bad, Keith. Secondly, I remember him doing that to me and feeling like that's not appropriate because when you do that, depending on your height, your junk rubs up against your butt. Do you know what I mean? Like, Sorry, I'm laughing because it's
The idea of Keith like bear hugging me from
That's what I
behind like
mean.
is making me very uncomfortable.
and that happened. I think that probably happened in my 12 years there, maybe 2 or 3 times. And I remember being very uncomfortable, but he was doing that to like all the women around me. So I was like, okay, this is just something that he does. He's also a chiropractor on the side, as well as being a judo champ.
The best chiropractor.
And a concert pianist.
The world-renowned chiropractor.
With the highest IQ.
When you were talking about the tumbling, when I watched that, all I could think of was that episode from The Office where Michael Scott is like rolling around and yelling, parkour, parkour.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can we move to 5 real quick?
Episode 5 was, I think for most people who I know who watched it was the one where people would text me and ask me things, because I think the whole story of Daniela being in that room was just the most impactful story for a lot of people that came out of season 2.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Would you agree?
Yeah, that's when we got the most like WTF, because a lot of our friends who knew our story, who didn't read the trial transcripts, that particular part of the story wasn't necessarily as out there. And it was. I thought they were able to reenact the what's it called, the animated reenactments really well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it dispels a lot of the she could have walked out any time response, which is when people say that, I'm like, well, clearly you don't know anything about coercive control, you moron.
Came in NXIVM, and the next day she was put in this room. She had been conditioned over however much time to listen to these commands, more or less. So again, it was breaking her down over time to lead her to this point.
And her family had buy-in. So her family had bought in. So it was she had a lot of forces pulling at her to be obedient and compliant at a young age, when your individuation is starting to happen anyway, right? So it can always be dismissed as defiant teenager stuff. So it was a shit show for her. That was tough.
If there's one episode people watch from season 2, I think that's the episode.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hope they'd watch all of them and see it in context. I think one thing I haven't shared here, and I've shared it many times publicly, is another experience I had throughout the whole episode was thinking, oh, wow, anyone who's still on the fence or has any loyalty to Keith, this will wake them up. This will cause them to go, oh, shit, I was wrong. Every episode was met with more gaslighting, more deflection, more denial, and specifically around Daniela and how she chose to be there and could have been there anytime. Actually, one of our listeners said something really funny just to break the tension of the particular tragedy of Daniela, was like, oh, if Keith was really so smart, he could have learned Espanol in an hour and had a conversation with the mother in Spanish. Good point.
Great point.
Why doesn't he know Spanish?
Hopefully that episode is just one of those things that people, if it didn't wake them up, it's something that they've added to their shelf and maybe made it a little bit heavier for them.
And that's my segue to episode 6. The shelf also should have, from episode 6, Nancy sharing that Keith left Pam sitting in her own feces for hours while they had breakfast. Well, Keith and Nancy had breakfast together.
That was hard to listen to.
I couldn't believe that.
Me neither. That was new information.
One of the things that I thought was great about episode 6 was that the filmmakers really captured the feeling outside of the courthouse when the verdict was read. I mean, I've covered many court cases over my years, and this was outside of the courthouse, like journalists, people who were there to watch the trial. When Moira and the prosecutors came out, just the cheer, and everyone was hugging, and there was just like this feeling of lightness. And it was like something I had never experienced at the end of any other trial. And I thought that they captured that really well in the episode. And I was really happy about that because it was very unique.
Did we see you sprinting?
Especially out of the federal courthouse for a verdict. Well, you have to because you don't have your phone or anything.
You had some wheels.
My
You had some wheels there.
My photographer, Chris Bolke, he had my phone outside, and he always knew when he saw me running, he gets my phone ready for me and opens Twitter and gets a tweet ready for me to go. And I think even we had drafted 2 tweets so he could just open my phone and pick the one that was right and get it out. So he and I worked together for a lot of my years at that station. So we had it pretty down pat at that point.
I love that.
Back to one thing with Nancy and knowing that Keith treated Pam like that. She knew that he treated Pam like that in 2016, because that's when Pam died. So the fact that it took her to episode 6 or whatever to remember that and reconcile that, there's a lot of things that had to be a problem for Nancy that she let go. That's one that I think most people, had they seen, would have had a problem with, particularly if you're following someone who's willing to treat someone who's, quote, their life partner for 20 plus years like that. And so to ignore that at the time speaks volumes about what her level of indoctrination was, but to continue to ignore it just speaks to the level of indoctrination. And how do you justify that?
That's a good point, Neb.
Do you think maybe she thinks about it in a different way now
I
that
think
she's
so.
sick?
I think she has to.
Yeah.
I think the universe forced her to reconcile her delusion because so many people were stacking up the evidence against them. Now, she had to in order to save face. And, now that her daughter did, there's so many things around her that are encouraging her to do that. Jail is one of those things. I think those people that are still loyal, faced with some jail time, aren't going to talk so tough.
Mhm.
And they don't have that. They're saying that's the reason those people caved, because they didn't want to go to jail. Maybe, but jail will sober you up pretty quickly, and I'll have you whistling the right tune. And those people, they don't have to face that. So they're acting brave on Twitter or whatever, but they're not facing real life consequences, except for the fact that they're just shilling someone's delusion now and for made up reasons of social justice. So, talk is cheap when it's on Twitter. But when you're faced with real life decisions with family members and other life decisions, you're going to make decisions differently, and it'll sober you up to the facts of the world. And they're not living in the real world. So Nancy's finally living in the real world.
Yeah. Do you remember there was I think the day, I'm going to get this wrong, but the day that she got sentenced, it was some day at court, like she was given the instruction that she couldn't talk to or have interactions with anybody from NXIVM. And then somebody from, Team Takedown from our side saw her in the lobby having
Two former
coffee
coaches.
for 2 former coaches. And it's like, she just still wasn't like in reality. Like, it's like it was always above the
There's a
law.
difference.
Yeah.
Lauren got on there and sat on the proverbial sword. And I don't know that Lauren could have done anything different to vindicate herself and free herself from whatever was going on with her in her own mind, in her own conscience, and her own character. She did it. There's nothing else that she could have done. Like the humiliation she went through, the emotional honesty that she demonstrated, the emotional bravery that she did on a stage, on a transcript, like she went through the door and got slayed. And Nancy didn't have to do that. I think Lauren is closer to healing and maybe healed. And Nancy, I think, is in whatever degree of that journey she's on.
She's got a long way to go, I think.
I think so. She has to reconcile a lot of things that she did just in her own life and her own family, let alone lying to thousands of people about who Keith was knowingly. That has its own karma.
Yeah. That being said, by the end of the season, I did feel like I wanted to reconcile with her. Like everybody knows that I want that for Lauren when we have legal permission. And I haven't wanted that with Nancy, but now I do. And Nippy and I don't have the same feeling about it. And that's fine. We don't have to agree. And it's a different journey.
I'm there with Lauren. I would talk to Lauren
Yeah.
again. And I said something in our very first podcast about what we're doing. And I said Sarah was, throughout this whole journey, is the person. I married the person I suspected she was. And it was tested by a set of circumstances. And her character was what I perceived it to be. When Lauren got on there and did what she did, I was close with Lauren. And I suspected she had a character as well. And it wasn't until that moment that she demonstrated to me that that's the person that she wanted to be. And it forced that set of circumstances for her to step up and be the person I suspected Lauren to be. And it wasn't until then that she came through as the person that I suspected her to be. Nancy hasn't demonstrated that. And I won't talk to that until I see that. Just for my own self-preservation, not to be a dick. But it's just, for me, I can't interface with someone who's operating on a set of assumptions that aren't reality-based. As far as I see them, I'm just not having a conversation. It's not worth it, So.
Yeah, I totally get that. Because you deserve to get something out of it too.
Yeah.
It's not like just a forgiveness thing. I mean, this was something you guys went through for a very long time and are still going through. And I think you guys have the right to deal with it in whatever way works for you. And I don't think anyone else really gets to judge that because they weren't in it,
There's some people, mostly in Vancouver, who had a problem with certain behaviors. And I said, listen, you don't get to tell me how I protect my family and handle my trauma. I don't care. I don't care.
Well, this is so great and so fun to do with you. I feel like we covered the key points.
Ayla, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
You're not far. So if we're in Greenville, which could happen in the next couple months, and you're in Atlanta, please let us know.
I'd love to have a glass of wine with you.
Fellow Southerners.
Yeah, absolutely. Northerners turn Southerners.
Awesome.
Big hugs. Thanks for taking the time to do this with us. This was so much better than Nippy and I asking each other questions.
This was great. Thanks so much for thinking of me. It's awesome.
Okay.
So
We kind of outsourced some of our salad.
yes, well, just to also let you know, we asked Ayla if she had a favorite Keith Raniere word salad. She said any of the source videos that are still on YouTube with Allison, the original Consumer's Byline infomercials are amazing,
Oh
or
my
the video
God.
with Susan Dones that she has of the group trying to leave. Instead of transcribing those for you, we thought you can, give you that assignment. You can go Google those.
Keith's playing Pac-Man
Yeah,
in it. Oh my God.
which is amazing.
Okay.
But instead, we thought we'd make one up for you.
It's a hodgepodge. I like the short hitters. I think those are the ones that you can get the sense of it. So
But these are from notes. I found these, right?
I got
from
it.
2012.
I got it.
These are like from a notepad.
In essence, we remove hate. You are either training for living or training for dying. Certain acts you would not do, regardless of feelings. So why not suffering and blame? I wonder if he's suffering and blaming in prison.
It feels like he might
I
be.
think he might be. So that means he's training for dying. Yeah.
And those are from notes from a head trainer forum with Keith, October 30th, 2012. Word salad put together.
So you guys training for living or training for dying?
I believe that was stolen
That
from that
was.
guy who invented the juicer.
Jack LaLanne?
Yeah. I think that's a Jack LaLanne quote.
I know. Well, I hope he's getting his walking in. Anyway, marinate on that.
Let us know what you thought of The Vow Season 2 in the comments on Instagram, or join us over on the Patreon for a deeper discussion.
Do you do voiceover work?
I do.
Sounds like it. Bye.
Bye.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Hope you liked this episode. Let's keep the conversation going and come hang out with us on Patreon, where we keep the tape rolling each week with special episodes just for Patreon subscribers and where we get deep into the weeds of unpacking every episode of The Vow.
And if you're looking for our show notes or some sweet, sweet swag or official ALBC podcast merch or a list of our most recommended cult recovery resources, visit our website at alittlebitculty.com.
And for more background on what brought us here, check out Sarah's page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, narrated by my wife, and at most bookstores.
A Little Bit Culty is a Talkhouse podcast and a Trace 120 production. We're executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, with writing, research, and additional production support by senior producer Jess Tardy. We're edited, mixed, and mastered by our rocking producer Will Rutherford of Citizens of Sound, and our amazing theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant and co-written by Nigel Asselin. Thank you for listening.
So have you
Exactly.
ever done a show in PVC?
Yeah, man. I did a tour in PVC and I regret it a little bit. I do, man. I regret it a little bit because I was just like, it wasn't very flattering on the top and then my knob was showing the whole time.
Moving right along.
Anyway, moving along.
Mum's like, I don't want to talk about your knob.
I don't want to talk about your
Not right now.
Not right now. I'll do it after the cameras are off.
So yes, you will.
Billboard chart-topping singer and songwriter Youngblood joins the Osbournes podcast. Listen now wherever you get podcasts